I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on gender and violence against political actors, the situation in DRC and Uganda, hosted by the Nordic Africa Institute. The webinar is the second in a series, so I hope to see you all again. The webinar is a part of a new research project entitled Making Politics Safer, Gendered Violence and Electoral Temporalities in Africa, with a particular focus on Ghana, Kenya, and Zimbabwe, and funded by the Swedish Research Council. You can learn more about this project and watch the recording of the last webinar in this series on the project homepage. From the participant list, I can see that many of you are familiar with the Nordic Africa Institute. For those who are not, we are a government agency funded by Nordic governments doing research within social sciences, science policy, and communication based on experiences from contemporary Africa, and we work as a knowledge hub bringing together African and Nordic researchers and policymakers. This particular webinar takes a point of departure in a new book, Gender and Violence Against Political Actors from Temple University Press, and it is edited by our first speaker, Elin Bjarnegård, together with Zetterberg. I'm looking forward to a stimulating debate on the nature of gender and violence and how it is addressed in the two African contexts, DRC and Uganda. Personally, I have collected data on gender and violence against women in politics at the local level in Ghana and found cases of semiotic, psychological, and economic violence. And it would be very interesting to listen to our speakers, Maria Eriksson-Bars and Paige Snyder, talk about the situation in other African contexts. We will also debate which measures can be put in place to combat violence against political actors with inputs from Maureen Schunke, who is based in Nairobi. So the program from today looks like this. First, we have 4 speakers who have all contributed to the book. And the first one that I would like to introduce is Elin Bjarnegård. She is the editor of the book. She is an associate professor of political science at Uppsala University, and her research interests are at the intersection of comparative politics, peace and conflict studies, and gender studies. Her publications have appeared in journals such as Comparative Politics, Journal of Peace Research, and Politics and Gender. She is author of Gender, Informal Institutions, and Political Recruitment from Palgrave Macmillan. So, Elin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will also try to share my screen here. There we go. Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Diana, for hosting this webinar, and thank you all of you for attending this. I am, as Diana said, I am the editor of a recent book on a very similar topic as the project that Diana is running at the Nordic Africa Institute, and I am very happy to be able to present not just the book, but different angles from the book in this webinar, as well as in other places, because one of the ideas behind this book was really to bring different strands of research and practice together that may not always speak to each other. So my task today, I hope, will be to tell you a bit about the book and the background and why we wanted to edit this collection, but also perhaps to situate the the speakers that you will hear from a bit within the kind of overarching framework of the book, because they will focus on their specific cases and their expertise. So this book really comes from an idea of, as I said, that different research fields all grapple with and have grappled with issues of gender, violence, and politics for quite some time now. But there are many intersections and many kind of subfields here that may not always speak as much to each other. I mean, we have, if we look at this as 3 different circles, we certainly have, you know, gender and violence. We have a big research agenda on gender-based violence in general. We can also put together violence and politics and look at both research and practical knowledge about political violence and what it is and what it means. And we also have gender and politics, of course, where we have a large research field looking at the opportunities and hurdles for women, for instance, to enter the political sphere. But what about when we put them all together, all these 3? What happens when we focus on both gender and political violence at the same time? This is in many ways an emerging field, or maybe emerging fields, because one of the things that I realized, I have, as Diana said, a foot both in kind of peace and conflict research and in gender and politics research. And I went to conferences and I heard people talk about similar issues, but with very different starting points and with somewhat different language. And I felt, why aren't we talking about this in the same room or in the same book? This is just an example of how different titles in academic papers, how we talk about gender bias in political violence, harassment and intimidation of parliamentary candidates, gendered online abuse, gendered electoral violence, violence against women in politics, political violence that is gendered, as well as rape in conflict, for instance. So all of these really are at the intersection of gender, violence, and politics, but are not necessarily speaking to each other. I think the same thing has been the case in practice, where we have different agendas that are focusing on somewhat, I mean, they're all looking at these 3 aspects. We have stopping violence against women in politics in the Not the Cost campaign with the National Democratic Institute, for instance. But we also have other frameworks that are looking at violence against women in elections specifically. And we have the whole women, peace and security agenda that is also coming from a slightly different angle, nevertheless focusing on gender, violence and politics. So our idea was to bring all this together, and we were brought together in Uppsala a few years back, just before the pandemic hit. So I sometimes wonder if this book, if we hadn't had that timing, would this book ever have happened? But the book is then focused in 4 parts, as well as an introduction and a conclusion. The introduction is freely available on Temple University Press's webpage, so you can all go there and read it if you're interested. The rest of the book then is divided into theoretical approaches, trying to really make explicit these different starting points that different fields come with. One part on the continuum of violence, as we call it, looking at violence in a broad sense. One part that looks at different case studies, emphasizing how this is really and truly a global phenomenon. And then finally, policy responses. How can we respond to this problem? To just say a few things about what the introduction tries to do, it tries to conceptualize gender as, yes, meaning women, but also meaning men and masculinities, and perhaps also looking beyond the binary, which is really a step that we think needs to be taken more perhaps than it has been. Violence, we conceptualize violence as a continuum of violence that goes beyond physical violence and includes also psychological forms of violence, as well as sexual and online forms of violence. And when we discuss politics, we discuss the fact that this phenomenon is happening and is visible in peacetime societies, as well as in conflict and wartime societies. And politics, of course, happens in everything from democracies to autocracies as well. The part that focuses on theoretical approaches, as I said, it tries to really make explicit the starting points that we all come with. And when we speak to people in our own subfield, we may not have to make them explicit. We may not have to explain ourselves, but we ask the authors to really do that in this book. Here today, we will hear from Maria Eriksson-Bass, who will speak about her chapter on conflict-related sexual violence against men, building a lot on her research in the DRC. The second part of the book, we will not hear anyone speaking about the continuum of violence today, but as I said, we have tried to conceptualize violence as something that ranges from psychological to physical, but then also we point out that sexual forms of violence can be both psychological and physical, whereas online violence is per definition happening online and is thus of a psychological nature. So this is the continuum that we ask all our authors to relate to. Part 3 of this book really demonstrates, I think, that this is a truly global phenomenon. It targets political actors of all kinds, voters, candidates, local level and national level politicians. It takes place in democracies and non-democracies. Today we will hear from Paige, who will talk about her research on election violence in Uganda. So looking at specifically candidates as well as a country that is not a democracy. And finally, then we have the part on policy responses, where we look at different levels where you and how you may be able to respond to this problem. We will hear from UN Women today. Julie couldn't be here with us, but Maureen is stepping in to hear more about the kind of normative foundations for ending violence against women in politics. So efforts at different levels and what states can do. Other chapters are looking at different levels and different types of responses. So I will end there and look forward to hearing more from the chapters. Just as a general conclusion of the book, I think that one thing that we really want this kind of research to start discussing is the continuum of violence and how we can place different types of violence on this continuum and still speak to each other, even if we are at different stages or parts of the continuum. We are also really showing, I think, in the book that we need more focus and knowledge on online violence. Several chapters demonstrate how sexual violence in different ways is a highly gendered phenomenon, that we need intersectional analyses, perhaps even more than we are able to do in this book. We need more knowledge on the perpetrators of violence, as well as on masculinity. And what the next question that we have to answer really is, what is then the impact of violence? What are the consequences of violence? And given that, what are suitable responses? So with that, I will leave the screen to the chapter authors.
Thank you very much for this, Elin. Hopefully we will debate some of these questions that you ended up with during this webinar. So the next speaker is Paige Snyder. She has a joint appointment with the Department of Politics and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of South Sydney, Her areas of scholarship include gender and politics, with a focus on gender and election violence and gender and sport in the Global South. So I would like to welcome you to this webinar, and thank you for getting up so early to be with us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Diana, and thanks to Mia and Anna and the whole team at Nordic Africa Institute for this opportunity to share my research. It's great to see Elin again, and I'd like to thank Elin and Per Zetterberg for their expert editorial work on the book. I think it's an excellent and very cohesive volume with a lot of important new findings. I'd also like to thank my research partner in Uganda, Dr. Elin, without whom this research would not have been possible. So I'll be reporting findings from research that examines the relationship between gender and election violence and local council races. And the field research was conducted in 2018 and 2019. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. And can everyone see that? All right. So the findings that I'll present respond to two research questions that are at the intersection of the study of political violence and gender and politics. The first is, to what extent does gender explain variation in types and forms of election violence and in patterns of targeting and perpetration? And the second, what is the relationship between gender and the drivers or motivation behind election violence? The research is informed by what we might call a gender-sensitive definition of election violence. And as Elin pointed out, we look at violence along the continuum and include types of violence that may have previously been overlooked in election violence research, and violence like psychological violence, threats, sexual harassment, intimidation that may be disproportionately experienced by women. So the country context is Uganda in East Africa. East African country of Uganda is characterized as a multi-party electoral system, but there is a dominant and quite repressive ruling party, the National Resistance Movement. So there isn't really a level playing field for opposition parties. The system is majoritarian, so a first past the post system, and they do have local council elections, so hundreds of different races for various levels of local council positions. Most of the races are directly elected, so a single representative or councillor for a district, but special measures also established reserved seats. So there is a 33% quota for women, and women have been successful in local council races. And so there's at least a third on most councils that I am aware of, and sometimes more than that, 45, even 50%. The respondents that replied to our survey that provides the data for this particular part of the chapter come from 3 regions of the country, 5 electoral districts. So they represent scores of different towns and villages throughout the country. We used purposive sampling techniques using initial contacts or seeds, and then relying upon those contacts to recruit additional participants. We use this type of method because we are interested in reaching what might be called hard to reach populations. And so these are individuals who are not only candidates who won, but candidates who lost elections at the nomination stage, so kind of a primary stage, and also the general election. And then perhaps most importantly, we were also interested in hearing from campaign agents or mobilizers. And these are people who are sometimes volunteers, sometimes or often they're paid. We know from prior research that agents are often perpetrating a lot of violence. And so we needed to speak to them. And that, as you can imagine, is kind of tricky. So thus we relied upon the level of trust that was there in my co-researcher and our seeds, the people who were from communities that already had pre-existing relationships with the agents. And then we relied upon 3 different types of data for the overall project: elite interviews, focus group discussions, and a survey, election violence incident report. And that is the data that I'll be presenting to you today, some parts of that. Respondents are primarily female and male candidates, elected party officials, and campaign agents. So I'll share with you just a couple of snippets of the data. The first is findings on the types and magnitude of violence. So you can see in the blue, the cells that are highlighted in the blue, that there is a range of different types of violence that were reported in the EVER surveys. And as you can see, if you look at the second column with the total number of acts, there were 274 discrete acts of violence that were reported over 98 episodes. So 98 surveys that had some violence that reached the threshold that we had established. And then within those 98 episodes, there were a range of individual acts of violence. So any single episode could contain one or more acts of violence, and often did. If you look at the second column, you'll see that threats of physical violence were the most common form of violence. And then we also had plenty of instances of verbal harassment, property destruction, deprivation, and physical violence, often quite serious, and also violence of a sexual nature, which I will talk about in a moment. So if you turn now to looking at the distribution of types of violence across targets, there's 3 categories: individual females or all female groups, individual males or all male groups, mixed male and female groups. So we're talking about individuals alone who experienced some violence, who were the target of an attack, or groups. The groups could be anywhere from 2 people on up to large groups that were generally comprised of a candidate and then agents, often supporters. And these events or episodes often occurred at campaign rallies or after campaign events in the evening, and so on. So if you look at the yellow cells, you see there that in terms of the distribution of physical violence, counts of acts of physical violence were fairly evenly distributed across female and male targets. But note that men or male groups had a much higher likelihood of experiencing physical violence. For instance, there were 27 episodes of violence where men or all male groups were targeted, and 18 of them, so 67%, included an act of physical violence. Whereas for females or all female groups, that was 31%, so 16 out of 52 episodes. So a pretty big difference there. The cells highlighted in purple show the distribution of acts of verbal harassment by the gender or gender composition of a group. And you can see that women experienced significantly higher levels than did men of verbal harassment, intimidation. And then the green cells highlight the large number of respondents who reported experiencing or observing threats of physical violence or economic harm. This was the most commonly reported form of violence, and we know that credible threats can be very effective in conditioning individual behavior. So there was a lot of that going on, but women alone or in groups experienced it at about twice the rate of men in our sample. And then finally, if we turn to the red cells, cells highlighted in red, here I separate out acts of violence of a sexual nature, and I emphasize it because of the distinct gender imbalance in targeting. Women experienced much higher rates of sexual violence, including rape, than did men. This comports with other assessments that find that politically active women must contend with highly sexualized political space and constantly navigate the terrain of sexual propositions, coercion, harassment, sexualized insults. And we did find that in our study. And then lastly, I was going to present some data here on the motivation or drivers for violence that we uncovered in our research. I'll talk about that first in terms of election context. So if you look at the columns there, you'll see that we have the two types of races in local council races, direct seat races and quota, women's quota seat races. In blue, the cells in blue are the three types of motivations or drivers of violence that we examine. And just note that overall, 67% of direct seat races and 64% of the quota seat races exhibited some form of violence that was of the nature or extent that it met the threshold for being included in our analysis. So there was a lot of violence, and this included violence in women's quota seat races between the campaigns of women candidates. So if we turn now to the types of motivations, the first, political, factional, that is what we would typically think of when we think of election violence. So violence driven by differences around partisanship, factional alliances, and so on. The second is sex discrimination or misogyny, which is what feminist practitioners and scholars have introduced as a kind of innovation in thinking about the drivers of election violence. And then finally, mixed motive. So we had respondents who said, you know, it was a little bit of both. I feel like it was a little bit of both. So now I'd like to point out that when you look at political, factional motivations, if you look at the yellow cells, you'll see that that was indeed the most commonly reported driver of violence in both the direct seat races and in the quota seat races. Turning to the purple cells, this looks at the extent of motivation, violence driven by sex discrimination and misogyny. And you can see that it was higher in direct seat races, as you would expect. I can talk a little bit about the type of violence and misogyny in quota seat races, but basically that is intra-party or within party violence. For the direct seat races, these are predominantly women running against men for direct seat contests. And then finally, I want to just mention that if you look at the perpetrators, so perpetrator characteristics, to highlight that men, so individual men or all male groups, did perpetrate the majority of the violence, about 60% of it, across all three types. But females and all female groups did perpetrate some violence, and there was a not insignificant amount of violence perpetrated by male and female kind of mixed groups. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions or go into any aspect of this in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much for enlightening us a bit about the situation in Uganda based on your research relating to the last elections in Uganda. I would like to encourage the audience to start typing some questions in the chat as we go along, and then I will attend to them after we have heard all the presentations and also heard from the two discussions. But next I will turn to Maria Eriksson-Barth, who is a professor in international relations at the Department of Government, Uppsala University, and her research interest includes gender and violence, post-colonial theory, civil-military relations, and research ethics and methodology. And she has, among a lot of other things, written the book, Sexual Violence as a Weapon of War, Perception, Prescription, and Problems in the Congo and Beyond. So please, Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Diana, for organizing this webinar. And also thank you very much, Elin and Per, for inviting me and Maria Stern to write in this book. So now we'll see if I manage to share my screen here. Do you now see it in the right mode? I wonder.
No.
You don't. Manage here. Now you see it.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you very much. So, so this chapter in the book is based on our research in the Congo that's been going on for quite some time, but it's also based on research that we did with the Refugee Law Project at Makerere University in Uganda, focusing on male survivors of sexual violence. So I should emphasize that so our chapter in the book is somehow maybe the odd one out in many senses. Firstly, we focus on a specific form of violence here, which is sexual violence, even if a lot of our research generally, we try to also see the connections between sexual violence and other types of violence. But also perhaps through the particular focus then on men and boys as victims. And also in contrast to many of the other chapters in the book, we do not focus on political actors in that sense, since the victims do not hold political positions as such. But since it's situated in a war context in the Eastern DRC, they are per definition understood as political. So I think we're all familiar with that idea that we see war as the extension of politics by other means, and the tendency is to see all kinds of violence committed by military actors in war as somewhat political. So all the violence that happen in war tend to be framed as political. It's either sort of accidental or collateral damage, or is strategic. And I would say that particularly then in relation to conflict-related sexual violence, that has been very much framed then as political. It's always political. And I think you see the picture here from Amnesty. I think that summarizes how we have been talking about sexual violence in conflict as political and as strategic, and especially then in relation to women. And of course, in the beginning, when this research started, also in relation to the resolution 1325, the researchers were also sharing this interpretation that we should understand sexual violence in war, particularly as strategic, building on the experience from Rwanda and also former Yugoslavia, where it was clear that the sexual violence was part of ethnic cleansing strategy and really political and strategic in that sense. And I should also say, yes, that in terms of numbers, based on estimations done by the Refugee Law Project, approximately 30% of the victims of sexual violence coming from the Congo then is done, the screening of refugees, are men or boys. So that's a sort of an approximate estimation of the numbers. So less than women, but still more than we tend to think. Yes, so this understanding then as sexual violence in conflict as being strategic has changed a lot the recent, I would say, 10, 15 years. So if you look at research more globally, because of course this attention to sexual violence in war also made the whole field to really explode in terms of the amount of research done on it. So if we should summarize that, and that very much also reflects the situation in the DRC, that actually is often not strategic, often is actually the opposite for various reasons, since you often need to be strategic actually to have good relationship with the civilian population, so thereby violence is often not strategic. It's also often not strategic for the business interests of different armed groups. And generally then, sexual violence is more often tolerated than encouraged or ordered. That's sort of the summary of the field if you look at conflicts globally, and also then very much reflected in the DRC context. So what we have seen in this field then is that we have underscored the importance of not, which has been the tendency before, not to conflate violent outcomes with the order's intentions of it. So I think, generally there's been this ideal image of military organizations as if they function in the way they should function. Because if they function in the way they should function, then everything that a soldier does is also a reflection of orders coming from above. But that's something that research has shown that we need to really rethink this and not conflate then the outcomes with orders' intentions, not even when it comes to really mass rapes or other mass violence. And that we need to then recognize more complex and also multiple driving forces, and how also different kinds of driving forces can be also involved in the same violent incidents. And you here see a picture of Elizabeth Wood, who is sort of a pioneer generally in the field. And she suggests that we should see sexual violence as belonging to 3 different types. So one is then this more strategic sexual violence, where it's committed in order to further some political interests, but also opportunistic sexual violence, which is connected. So it doesn't only have to do with sexual gratification in that sense, but it's sexual violence that is committed for some kind of more private reasons. And then as a third, she proposes then sexual violence as a practice. And that's more something which is in between. So it's neither strategic and it's not opportunistic, but it's a kind of behavior that is tolerated to happen. So this is how the field has moved. But interestingly, and that's what we also emphasizing in this chapter, that it has become much more complex in terms of how we should understand sexual violence, but mainly in relation then to women as victims. So we have been recognizing that it's much more complex. We cannot understand sexual violence in conflict as only strategic and motivated by politics. But still, when we look at the emerging literature on sexual violence against men and boys in conflict, we still see that this narrative is very strong. And we also interestingly see it when we listen to victims or survivors. I prefer victims also because not all people survive sexual violence. This picture you see here is from a poster from the Refugee Law Project, since they've also been addressing and having also groups for male survivors. So also doing interviews with both male and female survivors, it was interesting to see how male victims tend to describe the violence committed against them as much more political. So saying things like, yes, it happened to me because I was an important person in my community. And yes, with us men, it does not just happen by accident, like with the women. So also victims themselves frame it as much more political than the women tend to do, who then also can see other kinds of motivations behind the violence that was inflicted upon them. So what we're also opening up for in this chapter then is this question. So how should we interpret the different ways to interpret sexual violence against men and women? And what we suggest here is that it is also reflecting sort of familiar assumptions about patriarchal and heteronormative ideas, in the sense both that men are construed then as more political actors than women, and also a certain reluctance to even think about the possibility of more opportunistic motives being there, also building on this heteronormative kind of ideals. So what we're trying to do then is open up or suggest that we need to open up for more complex driving forces also when it comes to sexual violence against men and boys. Very shortly summarized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this intervention on DRC. And now I will turn to the last speaker, who kindly offered to step in the absence of Julia Bellington. So we have now Maureen Shunga, based in Nairobi, who is a regional policy specialist on women's political representation for Eastern and Southern Africa from UN Women. So please,
Diana,
the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me. Okay, that's great. So thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present the work of UN Women to address violence against women in politics. And thank you so much to the Nordic Africa Institute for putting a spotlight on this important issue. I acknowledge the previous speakers and the important issues that they have shared. So in terms of ending violence against women, it is one of UN Women's top priorities. And as UN Women, we support states to promote women's equal participation in political and public life. And a large part of that work is ensuring a safe environment free from violence for them to realize their political rights. But secondly, we also support evidence-based advocacy and develop tools for global data collection. We also provide technical assistance to our national partners, strengthen monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and provide capacity building to national partners with the election management bodies, civil society, etc. But within the UN system, our thought and practice leadership has influenced coordinated efforts to address the issue through country programming, high-level advocacy, and coordination with UN partners. Our work as UN Women is also underpinned by an updated normative framework. Our normative mandate as UN Women has propelled us to support global normative developments and frameworks to identify, measure, mitigate, and prevent violence. This included supporting former Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Madame Dubravka Simonovic, with a thematic report to the UN General Assembly on the issue in 2018. This was the first such report on violence against women in politics. In 2021, the report of the Secretary General for the 65th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, the CSW, recognized violence as a violation of women's political rights and a major barrier to their participation. I'm sure this was the case in Uganda through the study that was being shared as well. The CSW 65 agreed conclusions. They call on member states to create a safe and enabling environment for women to exercise their political rights and outlines the steps to be taken. So as UN Women, we put these norms into practice through programs. So in terms of our programming, we have worked on these issues since 2011, starting at first with developing tools to monitor violence against women in elections, and then producing a joint workbook with UNDP on program responses to violence in elections in 2017. Since 2018, under 2 strategic plans, UN Women has supported the development of over 100 program initiatives to address violence in over 40 countries. This includes supporting national partners with expertise to identify possible policy risks, conducting mapping and data collection to better understand the national context, providing support to national institutions to strengthen monitoring and prevention, as well as conducting capacity building of national partners, strengthening complaints mechanisms and advocacy and awareness as well. Some of the institutions that we have supported as UN Women include parliaments. So as the chief legislative institution, we see parliaments as playing a key role where they can act new standalone laws, prohibit or criminalize violence against women in politics, or integrate adequate provisions to existing ending violence against women laws. Parliaments can also take measures to ensure that the institution itself is free from violence and harassment. In Canada, for instance, the House of Commons adopted a code of conduct for members who are expected to maintain a work environment that is free of sexual harassment, and they must sign a pledge within 30 days after their election to the House. Working with election management bodies, we think can mitigate and respond to violence against women in politics by ensuring that voting agreements or arrangements rather guarantee women's safety, that candidates can campaign safely. Election management bodies can ensure early warning systems for electoral violence and security are not gender blind, and they can strengthen reporting mechanisms. So for instance, in Tunisia, executive members of the Electoral Commission in capacity building on gender-responsive electoral management and monitoring violence against women in elections, signaling the top-level commitment to mitigating violence. In Liberia, UN Women supported the National Electoral Commission to develop a protocol to address violence against women in elections in 2020. Political parties committed to apply sanctions against their members following evidence-based claims of acts of violence against women, such as suspension of a campaign for 5 days. Another actor, the judiciary. The judiciary may consider updating complaints mechanisms and response protocols, including for electoral courts that deal with violence against women in politics. So, for example, in Guatemala, the Supreme Electoral Court developed a protocol to address violence against women in political and electoral life, which serves now as a reference document for the court's related institutional training and education. And this has been quite useful. In terms of security forces and police are critical actors, is they have a duty to ensure public safety in political and electoral processes. Providing training can ensure that operating practices and security arrangements protect women through various gender-sensitive measures, such as safety and security arrangements at the polling station. For instance, in Nigeria in 2019, UN Women supported the capacity building on gender-based violence against women in elections through a series of workshops targeting 200 paramilitary personnel. In addition to this, UN Women has developed comprehensive training tools for stakeholders to help increase awareness and share good practices and interventions to address violence against women in politics. The global tools have been piloted in East and Southern Africa region, most recently in Zimbabwe, and will soon be rolled out globally. The last area that I want to highlight relates to the production of prevalence data through targeted surveys. I think the previous speakers also spoke about surveys. So we see that despite violence being recognized as a major obstacle to women's political participation, there have only been a handful of studies focused mostly at the national level without consistent comparables. To address this gap, UN Women has been working on developing harmonized data collection tools for 3 types of survey. The first one is called the Women Office Survey, particularly focusing on local government. The second one, candidates, and the third being voter. Surveys aim to provide data on prevalence of violence against women in politics, the types of violence, the specific settings in which it takes place, the types of perpetrators, the categories of women who are most at risk, and the formal reporting of violence. The first set of comparable data on violence against women office holders is already available in 5 countries, namely Nepal, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Tunisia. These data show, for example, that the prevalence of violence against elected officials at local levels is very high, varying across countries from 21% in Lebanon to 65% in Tunisia. Psychological and economic violence are the most prevalent types of violence, followed by sexual harassment. Most often, women experience discrimination, harassment, and violence in the political institutions that they serve. They are deliberately excluded from meetings and events. They are prevented from accessing resources. They're entitled to perform their duties. They're often at the receiving end of offensive, aggressive, or sexual comments, remarks, or jokes. So based on the pilot surveys and other surveys in the field, UN Women is in the process of developing global methodological guidelines with standardized survey instruments, allowing for country adaptation so the countries can adapt these methods to global use. So violence against women politicians exists in every part of the world, and many face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, cutting across sex, gender, age, race, class, disability, and political ideology. Men still hold 2/3 of the world's parliamentary seats, and just 27 countries are headed by a woman head of state or head of government. With today's many complex problems and crises, we simply cannot afford those women in power to be silenced and marginalized in the decision-making processes that impact everyone's lives and futures. UN Women will continue to support women's political empowerment in preventing violence until gender parity is achieved. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for this. And now we have listened to all the speakers, so we will turn to our discussions. And they have been given around 7 minutes each. So our first discussion is Anna Nensima, who is a PhD and a lecturer at the School of Women and Gender Studies, Makerere University. She is currently a postdoc at Makerere in collaboration with Agder University in Norway. And she has taught different courses on feminist theory, gender institutions, and social transformation and gender politics and the state. So please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I want to thank you for the opportunity that you have given me to be able to discuss these important chapters in the book that I find very interesting. I think they have already introduced me and we have very few minutes. So I must say that for the chapters that I read, they are quite interesting and revealing a lot of information that we see every day in our contexts. So I reviewed chapters 4, 11, and 16. And I see how really violence against men and boys has come up in feminist research. And I think that's a great step. And it's really important for us to be able to understand the different perspectives. I see contemporary analysis of gendered political violence very well captured in the chapters that I read. I see broad coverage of the forms of violence that constrain women's political participation. And I also see suggestions for ending violence against women in politics. Let me start with the one which I am more familiar with, and that is the election, since it was also the first presented. The election violence in Uganda. I mean, it brings out really the issues, the intersection between conduct of democratic elections and the struggle for women's equal political rights. It brings out the real issues, the struggles between the direct seats, which and then the quota system seats, which we normally call affirmative action seats, and how these bring out the gender dynamics and sometimes abuse. The chapter brings out the monetization of the electoral process. This is a big issue, quite very big, and I think which needs probably more attention. And of course, it brings out the sexualized political space. The chapter brings out very great cases, a case study of violence, and they are very well elaborated. From my perspective, I think that we need to interrogate this monetization of politics, because I think that the violence for me is a symptom of something. So I think that if we bring in a bigger perspective of interrogating the role of capitalism, neoliberalism, poverty, and unemployment in explaining this violence, I think it opens our kind of understanding these issues and being able to, because I think unemployment is quite an issue where politics is looked at as a job. And so it becomes a do or die. So even the campaigning agents, the campaigning managers are looking up to their candidate for something, even if this might be silent, but they are going to make it a do or die because they are expecting favors from this candidate. The voters themselves, they vote somebody because they expect something. And therefore you find that a lot of this violence is because they really want their candidate, because they know that when this candidate gets this position, this is what they are likely to benefit from. So that's why I'm saying that monetization of politics becomes a crucial driver in this violence. And I wouldn't do that without actually understanding the role of capitalism and neoliberalism and what this has actually contributed towards the poverty and unemployment. I think that this broader perspective would put these things in context and probably inform better solutions. So now that we are talking, and I also wanted to trickle our thinking, because as we talk about violence against women in politics, we are practically facing this aspect of the assumption that politics is not their space. That is the assumption that politics is not their space. I was wanting to trick our thinking. What difference would it make if we historicize this phenomenon of women in leadership? If we presented the heroic women in history, in African history? Because we have a problem that women's political roles, we tend to forget the women's political roles in ancient Africa. They have been totally buried, they have been totally ignored. And I think that if a different perspective on the reconstruction of the past can be based upon, gender can become a much clearer issue, even today. Until we raise the argument that male domination chauvinism or chauvinism did not exist in most African societies, and therefore women have a legitimate case, legitimacy. They have the legitimacy to join politics because it has provided for it. So I think that if we harness this power in this buried literature, that it could also be to make our points legitimate and probably reduce on some of these issues that we are facing. So this now should definitely lead me to the normative foundation for ending violence against women. I mean, the chapter identifies the state as a duty bearer with an obligation to promote and protect all human rights, and I think that's fundamental for me, that's important.
Anna, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I appreciate, I appreciate what is written in this chapter, the different gender deaths, all the different solutions that are being offered. But I want to raise a similar issue. I think we have witnessed institutional failure in most African countries since 1980s. Again, because of neoliberal theories. So how do we make sure that we redo the institutions, make sure that these institutions are able to handle sexual violence we are talking about, the judiciary to be strong. Because if we do not make this strong, then it becomes hard even to deal with violence against women in politics. If we cannot deal with defilement and rape, even in peace, then how do we ensure that we deal with this? Then, thank you very much. I think it's taking a
Thank you very much for this, Anna. And now we will turn to Amanda House, who is a distinguished professor of political science from Stellenbosch University. And she holds a research chair in gender and politics. She is also a project participant in the project Making Politics Safer that I talked about in my welcoming remark. Recently, she published a book called Feminist Institutionalism in South Africa, Designing for Gender Equality. And she has also contributed to the edited book that I did on gender institutions and women's political representation in Africa in the NI book series. So please, Amanda, go ahead with your comments.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you for the opportunity to make a contribution today. I want to start by congratulating Elin and Per with the book. I think it makes a very important contribution to a body of literature on violence against women political actors. And I want to start with the introduction by saying that your overlapping three Venn diagrams are actually quite interesting because it brings together those three concepts. And then you develop them into the violence into a continuum, which I think is important because we have been struggling with this notion of violence against women in politics, VAWP, versus ideas that is it only that the violence is targeted against women because they are women, or is it sometimes violence against any political candidate, regardless of gender? And I think this is the big issue, specifically in the African context, where there is a lot of intra-party violence that's often got little to do with gender, but a lot to do with political stakes and factionalism. And I think, that we need to, if we look at the concept of politics, we need to think also of politics outside the notion of just electoral politics. So when we see this, we see it during elections or we see it during campaigns and so on. But we have to actually look at electoral systems. And the issue here is that the closed list PR system is, with the quota system, is seen as the most successful to get women into politics. But what is not talked about is the fact that this system has an accountability deficit. So the accountability goes towards political leaders. And women then, to get onto those lists, have to do what political leaders demand of them. And we see then that when they don't do that, there's violence or there's threats and there's sexual harassment. So we need to also understand how our electoral system set up a problem that we later see during electoral campaigns and violence against women. And the consequence of this is that it actually reprivatized women, sent them back to the private sphere, because as Anna has also pointed out, it seems that then politics is not a woman's space. If we look at the concept of gender, and I think this is important in the sense that the book asked in what are the motives, right? So we've been looking at violence against women. Is it because they're women or something else? But I think the motives take this a step further to say, okay, so let's look at what motivates this type of violence. And it seems that there are types of violence that women experience more than men. And this is the type that's got to do with their sexuality, sexual harassment, threats of rape, threats to their reputation, calling them prostitutes, and specifically in spaces like online spaces. So the type of violence, I think, is important. And I think what we also need to look at here is that this is then set within an already existing set of attitudes that men and women have. And a lot of those attitudes are quite misogynistic. So we need to also think how existing attitudes feed into the type of violence that women experience. And I have done this in South Africa. I have done a survey, national sample South Africans, and I found the following. I was looking for a gender gap in attitudes towards women in politics. And what I found was that there was a big gender gap, and men say, well, a rather large percentage of men say, quotas are unfair. They do not want more women in politics. South Africa is not ready for a woman president, and women politicians should be more like men politicians. So you can already see that type of existing attitudes creates a breeding ground for the type of violence that women experience once they enter politics and once they run as candidates in political campaigns. Paige, let me come to your chapter, and I think it's a very interesting chapter, and I like the way that you've looked at the different types of violence, physical, psychological, online, and you include economic, and I think economic is important because of the fact that women generally have fewer resources than men, and if you do, make it really very difficult or set the threshold to for a payment to become a candidate too high, it becomes impossible for women. But then we can also include structural violence, and that's how women are located in society anyway. And my concern here is that when does everything become violence? That we use it in such a broad way that it becomes an empty signifier. And I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm just saying that we need to think about the consequences of this for empirical research, because how are we going to operationalize these concepts in a way that they are mutually exclusive? And I think that is something that we, will have to work more on that continuum, but I think is a very important continuum. But we also have to guard against using violence in a very broad way. I think we also need to include the consequences of the violence. And as I've said, the really creating a situation where women exit politics because of threats, because they fear for their lives, because their reputations become damaged, and so on. Maria, I followed your work, and I teach. I use your book to teach gender and IR to my students, and it's always been a very important book to me. And I'm so glad that you are disrupting this narrative of violence as or rape as a weapon of war, because I think it is much more complicated than that. And I think that we need to also understand the gendering there, right? So there's violence against women and there's violence against men in these wars, and even, prior to any conflict resolution. But is that violence, is it different? Is it different in terms of the type of violence or the magnitude of the violence? And Sheshehi Mbengi's work, to me, has tried to address some of that when she talks about big men and big women and little men and little women, and how the bodies in the Rwandan genocide were mutilated in a very specifically sexualized way. So I think, and that's, I think, something that we need to think about the gendering of that violence.
Amanda, I'm going to have to ask you to finish now.
I am at the end. I want to just end with this, the fact that to thank UN Women for being here, and to say that all these treaties and so on are really important, but we have to be able to domesticate them, to bring them down to a level that they get implemented. And I think the biggest problem or challenge in the African context is that we cannot domesticate these treaties because there are so much self-interest among political elites that just don't want to implement that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. I think we will have to leave those comments for now and try to turn towards some of the questions put forward by the participants of the webinar. There's one, Teresa Lewis, who is asking, I was wondering if during your research you came a little bit, I think, you focus on the role of education. I just reformulated it a bit. If yes, was there any indication that education had any impact on the level of violence? So I suppose this is for Paige.
So if we look at education levels among the candidates, these are local council races, so levels of formal education could be quite low, but candidates might have a great deal of respect from their constituents and from community members for their skills, their expertise, their knowledge, being trustworthy, levels of integrity, and so on. But I don't recall that formal educational levels mattered much in terms of the likelihood of being targeted. I think that that Ms. Nansima's comments about the economic constraints and the economic imperatives, and how I think we under-recognize that the fact that local councillors, if they're elected, then have usually access to some resources. And if the choice is some resources, some income versus none, people will fight hard for that. And so I think that is a kind of a much more important predictor of violence.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's also a question for Maria. It's from Adebayo, who is asking, could you please shed more light on strategic and opportunistic violence? Thank you.
Yes, okay, so I can try at least. So, I mean, this distinction between strategic and opportunistic goes long back in the sexual violence literature. So, the strategic, in this sense, of course, is forbidden, because all violence against civilians in war is strictly forbidden according to international law. But still, you see it in many conflicts, and not just sexual violence, but other types of violence. And of course, it can be strategic to use it in a sense in many situations, in addition to ethnic cleansing. When it's a way to punish populations for collaboration with the enemy, it's a way to get rid of insiders who are not behaving well and so forth. So you have that strategic, where you do it because it sort of fulfills some kind of political vision. But on the other hand, then some people think that it's useful then to talk about it as opportunistic. And often when you say opportunistic, most would think that it's about sexual gratification. But I will say that it's not just that, because you all have other kinds of motives behind as well. You might have private motives why you want to commit this type of violence. And connecting a bit also to Anna's comment there, because I mean, it's interesting when you dig deeper into many of these cases, you see how complex they are. I mean, for instance, in many cases, when you ask, why did this happen to you? You hear stories like, well, I had this shop I was really successful. My neighbor was jealous of my success, so she went to the military leaders and said I collaborated with the enemy. They came and they raped me and they beat my husband and so forth. So if you dig deeper, you see that a lot of the violence happening is actually about conflict between civilians that they are solving through this. So that's also a main message. I really think that we need to dig deeper into actually seeing what's happening behind these cases and not just look at the surface level. I hope that was a bit clarifying.
Thank you very much for this elaboration, Maria. There's one question from one of the project partners, Manditsa Parisi. So she's asking, beside the NGOs and CSO efforts, what strategies can be used to influence policy that can protect female politicians from violence, as the two groups may not break in weak democracies such as Zimbabwe? I think maybe that was one for you, Maureen. I don't know if you have any answers to that.
Thank you so much, Mandy. I think you're referring to what else can we do if the civil society efforts have not given us, or where they're failing to get traction in a difficult context. I think apart from the work or the strategies that are pursued by civil society actors, that there are other actors within the country context that we can work with, that can be encouraged, particularly maybe I'll think of legislators that we can raise awareness with, that can be influenced, I think, to promote positive laws that can address violence against women at the country level, because we see this as an evolving area of work where sometimes there are a lot of policy legal gaps, particularly on dealing with this issue. Some of the laws that are there don't actually deal with it to the full extent that perhaps we might want to see. But I think maybe we can also then look at other regional, the role of the RECs maybe in the region to support the efforts of civil society at the national level. And this can be to encourage, in this case, the member states to adhere to their normative commitments to CEDAW, to ACDEC, for the African context particularly, or to the Maputo Protocol, which all really also emphasize non-discrimination in the political space. And I think the participation of female politicians from violence would squarely within the ambit of those normative commitments that have been made by the member states. And I think at the SADC and EU level, then put in place as well that can be referred to remind the member states and to encourage political will to really ensure that, or to push really for protection and mitigation or response to violence against women in politics at the local level. Just some thoughts, Mandy, and I know this is a difficult question within the context of itself, and it really does still call on us to reflect further on what else can be done.
Okay, thank you very much, Maureen. I will take another question. There's one from Gibson Nyakatsino from Zimbabwe. He's saying his question is directed to Paige. It's a rather long question, so we have to listen carefully, all of us. Relating to violence in Africa/Uganda against women, considering that violence has been structural against women, but when we see from an independent point of view, women have responded to violence and oppression by waging a struggle for their emancipation, to which the belief was violence is therapeutic/liberating, according to Frantz Fanon. Are there present mechanisms in Uganda that have been set by women to deal with the issue of violence through counter mechanisms as a response to the violation of their rights by men, which they go through?
So there are a lot of trainings and workshops in Uganda for potential candidates, women who are interested in seeking office. And you know, a lot of Uganda has a very strong and effective women's movement network. And so, in fact, UN Women partners frequently with organizations, and they do go out into, you know, rural areas of the country and provide workshop and training opportunities where women who have been elected will, you know, share their strategies and their approaches to dealing with a kind of highly sexualized political space, what to expect. You know, there are laws generally against violence against women, but you know, as we know, its enforcement is very difficult. And you know, one thing that I just want to mention is that I think that the monetization of elections is so all encompassing that what our research showed was that women candidates are engaging in violence through usually their male agents, so their male campaign mobilizers, at about the same level as male candidates are in direct seat races. And so again, I think we have to look at kind of the motivation behind the violence. For gender motivated violence, sex discrimination, misogyny, you know, women do come together and talk about their strategies and approaches to manage that. But at the same time, women's campaigns are contributing to what are very high levels of violence in local council races. And that, I think, Ms. Nansima has definitely hit it on the head there. That is because of the monetization of elections and because of, you know, the opportunities, the economic opportunities and network opportunities that winning elective office, even at the local level, can provide to a candidate.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just see if we have any new. There's one question here, maybe a bit in line with what we have talked about from Rabab Baldo. It states, violence against female politicians and activists becomes a trend in many countries. However, there's no protection and prevention mechanisms put in place. My question is on the protection mechanism the research is proposing question mark. I don't know who will have any comments on this. Do you have any comments, Elin? Or?
Yes, sure. I can say a few words about that, and I guess basically direct people to the final part of the book where we look at what mechanisms are in place or could be put in place and how they would work at different levels. Because I think, as everyone will recognize, if we take this problem and look at it from this variety of angles, we also see that it happens in so many levels and so many spaces and has so many different motives. So of course we also need a multifaceted approach to tackle it. I think one thing that we have alluded to several times, I know Amanda touched on it as well, is I think to understand the problem better and to understand when is it in fact gender motivated and when is it the fact that women are in greater numbers entering a violent arena. They may be exposed to different forms of violence because they are women, but the violence may be directed to them because they are politicians. And if that is the case, we need to look at all the mainstream approaches that may already be there. We need to work with electoral management bodies. We need to work with political parties to see how they can do what they already do, but in a more gender sensitive way. But then, of course, there is also the kind of misogynistic violence that may need new approaches. And I think still working with political parties and looking at perpetrators and how we can work with codes of conduct to actually get at that part is one important step forward. When it comes to online violence, I think that's in itself an arena where the complexity is, it reaches so many people over such a long period of time, and it's very difficult often to pinpoint perpetrators. So that's also a challenge that will need new legal mechanisms. It will need increased awareness also among political actors. And I can recommend for online violence specifically Gabrielle Bardal's chapter in the book, where she looks at different levels of online violence and how we could potentially respond.
And Diana, I have just a quick response to that question as well.
Yeah.
Going on what Elin was saying. So one thing that we just, were able to uncover in our research is that individuals at the local level and rural villages and towns and so on, they really fear elections because they know it's going to bring violence and it's going to really tear at the fabric of communities, friends against friends, family members against each other, and so on. So it's a really serious problem. They want to eliminate it. They know that it's a problem for women candidates, but they also know that monetization of elections is really kind of the source of the problem. And I just, so on the one hand, with violence against women in politics, I think that Elin's mention of codes of conduct for parties to agree to come together and agree that they're going to, decrease, eradicate, stop the violence would be great. Violence against women, violence generally. But I also think that NGOs, CSOs could get involved in the process much earlier. So it really needs to be treated almost like a community health problem rather than a political problem. And if CSOs and NGOs could start earlier to work with community leaders and community members and people who are candidates and elected officials in those districts, to come together and begin to have community conversations. People want to talk about this. They want it to stop, but they don't feel, I think, that they have as much of a voice as they would like to have.
Okay, thank you for that. And that will be the last comment, unfortunately. I have a feeling that we could actually continue talking about this for a very long time. So I want to thank you all, the presenters, the discussants, and also the audience for the great questions, and also again congratulate you with the book and the important insights and debates that it has. I will also encourage everyone who is listening and who are still with us to check out the project homepage to get an idea about what our research project is about. And as I said in the beginning, you will also find a recorded version of the first webinar we did with Mona-Lena Krog, who has done work on violence against women in politics specifically. And you will also be able to find this webinar in a recorded version quite soon, and other materials that we are doing and developing during the course of this project. So I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day, no matter where you are. We have so many people with very different locations together today. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.